Hey everybody, this is Craig Brasco again. This is my third video for the summer intensive, and the subject for today is I call it intermediate digital painting. But I'm taking what we did on the first video, doing something a little more complicated, and excuse me, wanted to just talk about some and show some things that are a little bit more advanced, I guess, and concepts that we can also use for tomorrow's video as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my desktop here. And of course, thanks for being here. I really appreciate you watching. So hopefully you can see my Photoshop window here. So what I've done is in my Dropbox folder that I mentioned on the first video, I have some still life photos that are a little bit more complicated than the apple. And I just chose this one that has these two nice fonts and an apple and a pear. And what I've done is I'm going to go ahead and show you my layers here real quick. So, excuse me, I've created, just like the apple project, let me pull this out here. I've got a layer for my sketch. And before that, I actually did these other layers, which are the silhouette layers, if you will. I did a quick doodle and then filled in the silhouettes and then came back and cleaned up the sketch as best I could. So I've got a layer for the objects here, and I've got a layer for my sheet, and then a layer for the wall that's like kind of on the left side. And the other part of the wall, excuse me, I'm just going to leave that blank. So I've managed to separate this into what I think are three big parts, like so. All right, and here's my sketch. So at this point, of course, if you want to follow along with this, what I recommend is you can either just watch me do this part, this video today, and then go back and pick one of those still lifes, or you can do this one, or find one online and get it to this point where you have a nice sketch, and on layers underneath that, put in your silhouettes. So I use the same gray value as before. It's like about a 50% gray, maybe a little darker. If you want to use black like we did in the second video, that's fine, but I recommend you do that special adjustment at the end so that you can actually see the like a lighter gray value to paint with, or paint on, I should say. So like I said the other day, I think, and I'm gonna just like clean up while I'm talking because the sketch is okay, but it could definitely be better. I think drawing from life is a really, really great thing. And I think all artists should practice that. If you want to be more adept at your craft, even if you don't see yourself as somebody that draws realistic things, it's really just a matter of getting your hand-eye coordination practiced, and nothing better than a still life, except maybe figure work, like I said in the second video. Unfortunately, figures are not that easy always to have around, and whereas inanimate objects like this, where you're drawing things like fruit and vases and stuff like that, that's actually pretty accessible. And of course, you can draw whatever you want. You can draw toys or shoes and clothes and anything. So I do like to have a sheet, though, like this particular photo has, and I like to try to light it in a way that's interesting. So I did not take this photograph. Unlike the apple, this is a friend of mine's, and he did mostly an upper left lighting. I'd say it's more like, yeah, it's more like middle left, but it's still pretty good, especially over here. if you look at the photograph I have up in the top left corner, those shadows that are generated on the right side of this vase on the right, and how it's casting a shadow on the apple really starkly. That's really cool. And then you notice like the light is gradually falling away to the right side of that apple. That's pretty great. The left side, it's not so dynamic in terms of contrast and shadow, but there's some pretty neat things going on with the reflectivity of the silver here. So I think that's just fun to paint. And actually, I would say the sheet has some pretty decent values going on, but certainly the most interesting part is on the right side. I'm probably not going to paint the whole thing today. I'll probably, not surprisingly, end up focusing more on the right side. But really what I wanted to show today was some more techniques about how to use layers to get your painting going quickly so that you can get to the fun part, which is what we all like to do, is details and rendering. And again, I'm a big fan of taking your time and doing things, I guess, techniques that are easier to do first and then work on the hard stuff last. Too many times myself and then students of mine like to do the hard stuff first, like the real tiny details and, real intricate drawing things, that's great. But, when you're not looking at the bigger picture of things, you're going to lose that sense of composition, and you're going to lose really just what are very simple things to knock out right off the bat. And then you're going to have to go back and do them. And even if you use layers, that can be hard to do. So so now that I've got all these silhouettes here and I've got the sketch and stuff, what can I do with this? Again, probably one of the neatest things about Photoshop in this regard is this button right here. So if you look here, try to zoom in if I can. This is the layers window I'm zooming in on, and hopefully, and this is the word lock here. And right next to it is that checkerboard button that we talked about pretty much every session now. It's called preserve transparency or lock transparent pixels. So what that does is if I click on that now, and let's say I get a brush, and I'm going to choose a color here really quickly. Let's see. Yeah, that's not bad. All right. So if I paint with this color, see what happens is it only applies to pixels that already exist. And that's really great, because really what that means is it only affects the objects that are silhouetted under my sketch. That includes the pear here, but what I could do is very quickly switch to a different color like this, right? And just paint that guy. This is super duper handy. And I'm going to show you guys some more advanced stuff in a minute once I block in these colors. So what I'm doing right now, and this is kind of really more of a painting topic, not necessarily digital painting, but just painting in general. And I've heard different things from different artists, but what I'm doing right now is I'm trying to find what's called the local color, like the word local, like something that's nearby you. Local color means, in essence, the idea is that it's a color that represents the majority of an object. So, for instance, if I look at this pear, to me, that pear looks very yellow greenish. In fact, probably more yellow than green. So, and it's very bright too. So what I'm trying to do is decide on a color that suits that. And apply that color. Now, the other thing I'm thinking about too, though, is that there's light hitting this object. So if you look really closely, let me see if I can zoom in here. That pear has a little bit of shadow on it. So if you zoom in a little bit here and see, right, let me make my brush smaller, like right about there. That's really the local color. It's kind of in between right in there. It's kind of like a, ooh, um, it's like a neutral yellow green, and here I've lost my window. That's not good. All right, sorry about that. I zoomed out of my painting instead of the camera and lost it. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is, let me just do it this way. This is really the local color. This brighter yellow orange or yellow green over here is a little more like the local color brightened or saturated by light. So I'm trying to really pick something more like in that corner. Now this vase here, that's tricky. I'm actually tempted to make it darker than it appears because, and I tend to just do that in general because I am looking to add lights and darks. I mean, that's true for any of these things. So I'm kind of, the other thing is this is silver and it's very reflective. So it's almost like it doesn't have a local color because it takes on the color of things around it because it's so reflective. So that's why I'll probably just stick to this boring gray color here because that's, I can adjust that pretty easily. Now this next guy over here, he's kind of more tarnished silver, right? So I'm gonna pick kind of a stodgy copper-ish color. That's a word I don't get to use a lot, stodgy. It's definitely stodgy, but it's nice. It's kind of this really interesting copperish color. That's a little too dark, I think. So I'm gonna push that back. There we go. That's okay. Now, color is interesting. It's a very complicated subject. When it comes to art, I can't really think of too many subjects that are more difficult than color. The main issue here, too, is that everybody sees color in a different way. From very dramatic differences to very subtle changes. So I'm always just going by my sight. I don't ever click on a photograph to get a color. It's like I talked about in the first video. That's just a terrible idea. It never works. And guess what? In real life, when you're drawing from a still life, you can't do that. That's one thing you just cannot get around. No matter if you're doing digital art or not, you have to use your brain and try to pick the color as best you can. While I'm finishing this up, I'll just go ahead and say, too, there's an artist I really admire. His name is Stephen Assael, and he is a good friend of one of my colleagues, who's also a good friend, Robert Shear. And Robert invited Stephen down to do a demo, which I was like super excited and really enjoyed it. And he actually said that there's no such thing as local color. Like there is no, like this orange is, or this fruit here, apple, is not really red or orange. It's a, agglomeration of like all these different colors, which is true. So when he paints, he doesn't really think about it. He just picks some colors and goes, and then as he's painting, he just adds on light and shadow, which in turn creates this colored object. So that's pretty heavy and complicated. And I agree with him 100%. And it's really difficult to translate that and talk about that. What I think, though, is that instead of trying to postulate that, you really should try to aim for just some color that's basically neutral and not too dark and not too light, that resembles the object. And, as long as you're guessing in the right direction. For instance, I wouldn't paint this pear like this. I wouldn't do this and paint it purple. I mean, like, that doesn't really make sense. I don't really see any cool colors there. And although that's very interesting, that's not what that is. I mean, to me, it's greenish, yellowish, neutralish, like a greenish gray color. And I can work with that. I can start to add and change things to that as I go. All right, so there's that. And I'm going to save my document. So that's, again, Command S on the Mac and Control S on a PC. What I'd like to do next is kind of start setting up a stage for the lighting. And I think the easiest way to do that is to give the sheet some attention. So I'm going to pick a color that I think is going to be kind of cool in temperature. So when I say temperature of a color, this is another like 2D color theory lesson or knowledge, I guess, is cool means something in the range of blue, green, or purple, in the color wheel. So if I pull up my little swatch wheel here, that's not the right thing. Here we go. This color wheel is fairly accurate. This is the one I showed in the first video. So if you haven't watched the first video, I recommend you go back and check that out. So on the right side of the color wheel here, from this yellowish green all the way to this darkish purple or reddish violet, those are generally cool colors. The opposite would be from yellow to red, or even this darkish red. Those are warm colors. So there's some crossover in there where they actually become neutral, red and green. They're kind of not too hot or too cold. So I always try to avoid not using any color that doesn't have a temperature. Okay, so it's got to have something. And this is super important in this decision. Most people, when you see this image, okay, you're looking at the sheet and going, hey, that sheet is white. Sort of. There's really, when you look at a camera and a photograph, you have to kind of interpret it a different way. There are some pure whites in here, probably, and there might even be a couple of pure blacks. But in essence, I try to avoid ever considering that in a painting. I always give colors. I use colors, and I give them a temperature. So I try not to use white, and I try not to use black. And if I ever do, it's in extremely small measured amounts, and it's usually at the very end of a painting, just to give it a little bit of pop. To back up why, because I have students ask me that. Again, value and color are two different things. They work together, but separately, they are very different. So on this figure, again, you'll see the color wheel, and underneath it is a value scale. The value scale goes from, this light white, gray to black. So our brains are hardwired to see these first. Our brain tries to figure out light from shadow first. Color can exhibit value, but when you put it together with pure value, the value is going to win. It's going to get your attention almost every time over color information. It's a very quick thing. It's almost subconscious. So when you're an artist and you're painting, this instinct to say, well, hell, I'm just going to use white for this whole thing. That's not such a good idea, because if I painted this whole sheet white, it's just going to dominate the whole image. So I don't want to do that. I want to try to find a temperature of let's say really light gray that is gonna pretty much do the same thing. Like it's not pure white, but it gives the impression of the value contrast. Like, yeah, this is obviously very bright. And that's the other problem with photographs is they tend to be blown out. Like this is not the best photograph. I mean I like the composition and I like the subject, but as a photograph, it's a little heavy-handed on the light and it's definitely overbearing. It's burned out is what we call that. Like right here, it's extremely bright. Now I could have tried to run some filters and stuff like in Photoshop, but it's just not really worth the effort. Um, I can work around it. If it's too glaring for you, I mean, that's the thing. Don't be super picky about what you paint, and especially when you're painting from life. So if you don't like any of the still lifes I have, that's totally fine. Go get out on the internet. There's plenty of decent still lifes out there. So I'm just knocking out just a quick little bit of value here. Let's just say color. So I chose this kind of cooler color, and the reason is because I've got these really bright objects that are on the table that are mostly on the warm side, I would say. Because even though that pear is kind of greenish, right? It's probably more yellow. So I just want a cool opposite. So if I just tinge this white a little bit blue and make it kind of cool, that'll help these things just pop right out. Now this layer, I don't think I remembered to turn on the preserve transparency, but I really am not too concerned. And the reason is because the objects I have are on top of this layer. So if I paint something under here, right, it doesn't matter because this will be in the way. Like this will kind of cover it, if you will. So I can be like a little bit more careless, I guess. Although I really think you should kind of be more mindful of that. So um, I'm just going to paint in some more blocky details. Again, I apologize. I am using my brush set, which you're welcome to have. You can just email me and I'll give these to you. And in the first video, I believe I covered how to install them. If you're not sure, even then, you can easily find a tutorial online for probably Photoshop 2019 or 20 on how to install brushes. But I'm using the #1 pencil rough, which I used to sketch with, not just lines, but these kind of blockier, bigger passages. So I'm just kind of quickly adding in some details here. I'm kind of sad because my cat who doesn't normally sit with me when I'm working, she just decided to come visit me today earlier, and I was hoping she would hang out so you could see her, but she's gone. Maybe she'll come back. All right. So again, my big reason for doing this is easy. It's easy. I try to make the process of painting easy and fun so that I can get to the harder things to do faster. Um, for years and years when I worked, I didn't understand how to do that. And I still sometimes don't get it. And I don't think and go, plan things out. And, as a oil painter, like it was really hard for me to switch over to digital. And I kind of had to in grad school. So because it was so quick and forced, it took me even longer to learn how to do some of these things and how to slow down also and kind of just do things that are more fun and not so labor intensive. and still get the same result that I was in the past. I mean, I guess you could say the same thing about traditional painting too. Easily, yeah. Okay, not too shabby. All right, I'm going to leave the wall alone because to me, it's really not that important. I mean, it's just two pretty flat values back there. So instead, I'm going to turn my attention back to the objects. And this is where I get to talk about some more advanced stuff. All right. Here's my layers again, and I'm going to rename this to sketch. And of course, just like the apple, eventually what I'd like to have happen is let it dissolve away. Now, right now, I'm using the opacity control on the layer to kind of simulate that. But really what's going to happen too over time is that is going to just disappear, you know, because I'm just going to render it. All right, so let's look at some tricks and talk about some different approaches to how to shade and light your stuff very quickly. Um, so I mentioned that I'm using preserve transparency. So what that does, of course, is it allows me to just paint inside the lines. But here's another trick that is kind of the same, but it allows you to kind of extend what you've painted to different layers. And you'll see why that can be very helpful here. If I put my cursor over, I'm kind of scared to zoom in again because I don't know if I can get back out. If I put my cursor over the thumbnail for my layer, it looks like a glove, right? It looks like a gloved hand kind of pointing. So watch what happens when I press the command key. When I press the command key, the cursor changes to this little dotted box that's underneath the glove. And I think on a PC, that's going to be the control key or maybe the alt key. I'm sorry, I don't know that one for sure. But just try different keys till you see this cursor. All right, so what's the big deal with that? Well, if I click on this now, what happens is I get a selection that is based on the shapes that are in that layer. So in other words, I can take my silhouettes that I've already drawn and then just turn those into a selection. That's pretty great. Now, if you're not happy with your silhouettes, because like right now I can see where there's some problems, you can always go back and fix those by just coming into your layer, deselect if you have a selection, undo the preserve transparency, get your eraser tool and your brush tool, and just clean it up. Even if you've already done some painting, like that's not too big a deal because I haven't done very much. That'd be another thing if I had started rendering. That's bad. So you really want to make sure that you give your silhouettes as much attention as possible before you move on to these next stages, because eventually what's going to happen if you don't is you'll have to, you know, end up redoing a lot of stuff, and that can get kind of cumbersome. On the other hand, I don't know if I'll get to this today, but eventually what I end up doing is just painting freehand anyway. Eventually I get to a point where I would be painting like in real life because I'll just merge all the layers together and paint freehanded. I wouldn't try to do that nowadays. It's just too much work. But this can kind of propel me forward to a point where I can paint freehanded and get away with a lot more mistakes. Let's just put it that way. So I'm going to just say, hey, I clean this up a little bit. I'm going to turn the preserve transparency button back on, press command, and then click the thumbnail and get this nice selection. Okay, so now what I can do is make a new layer. In fact, I'm going to make two. So I press the new layer button 2 times. That's this little square button with a plus sign right next to the trash can. And I'm going to do something special here. So this first top layer, I'm going to call this shading. And then the layer above it, I'm going to call this lighting. You can tell my cat's been here because there's cat hair like all over my keyboard. Okay. All right, so the shading layer and lighting layer, this is really important because um, when it comes to rendering, you don't want to use like a short kind of stubby stroke to do rendering at this stage. You know, I can see plenty of passages on here where I would love to do that, you know, like right here, right, where that light source is hitting the vase or the font. Same thing here, and these nice little kind of lighter, that looks more like a peach, doesn't it, instead of an apple. Not sure, but these little kind of highlights here, I want to, you know, use a nice kind of scrubby mark making stroke when I do that part. But for these larger things, that I can't do that. That takes too much time. So if I use a selection and I use separate layers, I can do this a lot faster, and it gets even better because I'm using digital media. So what I mean to say by that is layers have what are called blending modes. Blending modes. So you find these in different places actually in Photoshop, but the most, I guess, the first place you'll see them the most is in the layers window. So I'm going to zoom in here. It's this drop down menu that's right to the left of opacity. And if you click on it, it's got all these terms and weird things. Really quick lesson here. Where these come from is photography. So photography, in the darkroom when you're making photographs, there's different tricks that you can do with how photographs are made, and that's where these come from. Like if you've ever heard the term dodging and burning, maybe not. That has to do with how an image is projected onto photographic paper and how you can manipulate light to make a photograph appear a different way. All those tools are present here. And although they're not really meant for painting, not in the traditional sense, you can totally use them and they're pretty cool. So for shading, I like to use darken. And then for light, indicating a light source, I like to use linear dodge or add. Now, I'll go ahead and tell you that this is tricky. And the reason it's tricky is these blending modes can be really powerful and they can make changes happen really fast, which is good because you can do things quickly, but on the other hand can be a little daunting and be a little strange. So I'm going to walk you through how to use these and show you how they can make your work a lot faster, and try to show you different ones too, because there are other ones I like to use as well, like soft light and multiply. So they kind of do the same things, and I'll try to point out what that is. But in general, the idea is you're either adding intensity of light or intensity of shadow. That's pretty much the deal. So for the shading layer, I'm going to set the layer to darken. So that's a mode now. So like it's changed to that. Then for lighting, I'm going to switch that to linear dodge, like so. All right. So now the trick is understanding your light source, which I am a big fan of that. I think it's super important. So if I look at this image, to me, I mentioned this earlier, I don't know if this is truly upper left. I think it sort of is. It's kind of more like middle upper left, because I see a light hitting here. In fact, I think this is the photographer reflected in the vase right here, right? And that's the flash of the camera. So there's definitely some light there. And the similar light source is kind of here on the pear. It's for sure on this font on the right, and then this peach or apple kind of in the same place. So they're all hitting the objects similarly. The other thing is there's a lot of ambient light being reflected off of the sheet. So if you look here at the bottom of each font, you can see this kind of curved light, because that's light bouncing off of everywhere, the ceiling and the walls, and then hitting the sheet, and then and then subsequently bouncing off the sheet and then hitting these objects. And if you look really carefully, you can see that too on the apple peach, whatever that is. Not so much on the pear. The pear seems like it's really got a lot of light. So there's not a lot of shadow. So it's hard to see where all the light's coming from. It seems a little oversaturated. Not the best subject, like I mentioned earlier. There's definitely a lot of cooler things going on elsewhere. Okay, I'm going to save my work. And before you do anything big like this, I definitely recommend saving, because you can break stuff pretty fast, and you want to be able to revert to an older version in case that happens. All right, so I'm going to start with shading, and I'm on the shading layer, which has been set to darken, and I'm just going to get out my brush here. I'm going to just start applying some color, some shadow value, basically. Now, here's something else. Like, if you don't like a selection being active, like if it's bothersome, you don't like those, dotted lines, you can actually hide these. If you hit Command H, they'll hide them. But if it's the first time you've ever done that, like say you just got Photoshop installed on your computer and you started doing this project and you're following my instructions and you're hitting Command H, you're going to get a window that says, do you want Command H to hide extras or hide Photoshop? And you're going to want to say hide extras, because what extras means is like selections or guides or anything like that. Don't say hide Photoshop, because you don't ever really need to do that. I mean, if you want to hide Photoshop, you can just minimize it, like, hitting the minimize minus button up here. Like, you don't need a key command for that. So always say hide extras. Okay. So I'm going to start by just going in here and trying out my shadow planes. Now, what's really cool about this is, because of the way I have it set up, I don't have to worry about going outside the lines. I don't have to worry about, painting on the sheet, because that's not going to happen. All right, so I'm going to give a little bit of love to this pear here, not too much. And definitely the handles, they're pretty dark. I mean, they're so thin, and they contrast against the backdrop so much that they almost just look like silhouettes anyway. Maybe not so much this one, but definitely the other ones. All right, so this color I don't really care for on this object. I don't think that works. So I'm going to switch to this kind of grayish color here. Like that. Okay. Now, if you want, you can keep adding to this. You can try different colors. And just keep in mind, I'm not using black, okay? I'm not going to use black to do this. I'm always going to try to find a color, because light is color. And even the absence of light is color. So I'm trying to avoid using any pure black. I'm going to work really hard to try to find something similar to that that's just extremely dark. And sometimes I might not like what I do. Like, so I chose kind of a warmer, kind of a greenish color for that, and that was not the best choice. So, and I don't really like this bronze color either. So I'm going to push it more kind of magenta-y color. There you go. So it's always about experimentation. You should try different things until you find something you like. And since we're using layers, you can get away with this pretty quickly, and you're not really committed to anything. So if you don't like this at all, then you could delete the layer, right? Make a new one, do the same brush mode, blending mode, I should say, and then go to town until you get what you like. Now, again, I'm trying to just do some very quick, selections here of color to shade with. And I'm going to try to move on to the lighting part so that I can do some rendering. This video, I'm going to probably do like the first one. It'll be a little bit longer, but I'm going to fast forward it so that you don't have to like sit and watch me paint all day. And then you can watch how I'm like rendering stuff. So I think that'll be nice. The other thing I'm constantly looking for when I'm doing this is like the darkest darks and the lightest lights. So I'm trying to find those little moments of accents, you know, where there's like the darkest information and the lightest information, and trying to stay true to that as much as I can. Again, anything I can do like this in the beginning, that's less work later on. All right, so I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to go ahead and save this. If you want to experiment, you can do other things too. And this gets a little crazy, but the brush itself can be changed to a different blending mode. In fact, I could do multiply brush on a darkened layer like this. Now, that can get pretty wacky pretty fast, so be careful. Like I said, change the opacity of your brush if things start getting too dark too quickly. So you can hit the number keys to do that, remember? So I can hit 2 on my brush, let's say, and still use that multiplied brush on the darkened layer. And you see it doesn't get as dark as quickly when I change that brush opacity level. So I can kind of try and tame it, you know, as much as possible. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. Might be a little too dark on that vase on the right, but I can fix that later. All right, so this next one is the one, I'll just go ahead and tell you, it's my Achilles heel. It has been for years, even in traditional painting, and that's going into lights. To me, this is the hardest thing to do in any painting because it's tough. It's hard. So applying light can be a little daunting. And I think what you have to do is just go for it. You know, you can't be scared of it. So what I'm going to do is try to find a color of light that applies to each object, because I'm probably going to have to do these separately now. And on that add layer, I'm going to start adding in my lights. Now, you got to be careful again, because what happens is this starts to compound very quickly. So use a low opacity to start with so that you're not overdoing it. And where you see the light really starting to, you know, kind of come more potent, that's when you can hit it a couple more times. And I don't do a whole lot with this other than just kind of get it going. So I'm adding kind of a yellowish color, or trying to, let's just say, to the pear. And I'm going to do kind of a light orangish color to the peach apple. We're still not sure what that is. Like that. And then I'm going to probably just use kind of a nice grayish color for this particular font. So it's almost like what you're doing is you're just kind of getting down to the nitty gritty right off the bat. Like you're just trying to block in colors and lights as quickly as possible. And what we're going to do is once I'm satisfied with this, I'm going to end up just painting on top of it in a free-handed fashion, essentially. But all this in the first place just allows me to do is just kind of figure out everything first. Helps me kind of plan stuff. Now I'm kind of stealing colors from other parts of the painting because to me that tarnished area looks kind of orangish to me. And I'm going to start kind of sharing a little bit of color here and there. That's also a design thing. Like I'm intentionally trying to scatter some colors across so that they're not exclusive to just one object. You know, I can like pull some of these other colors in here and there. Okay, I can live with that. That's a good plan. That works for me. So the next thing that's going to happen, and this is where I'll probably stop talking for a while and just paint, is when I get to this point in a painting, I like to make a new layer, and this is just a normal layer with a normal brush, and I'm going to just start painting right on top of everything. Because now that I have everything planned out, I've got all my lights and my darks here, I'm just going to start painting like right on top of the object. Now, do I keep the selection active? Sometimes I do. It's actually still here. I think for this time, I'm going to actually turn that off because I'm ready to kind of move on from that now. Now that I've kind of planned everything out, I don't really think I need that anymore. And now I can skip to the fun part, which is actually, you know, doing some painting. So I'm just going to paint probably this vase and apple on the side, and I'll leave that other part there probably. And this is probably in the video where I'll be speeding things up too. So. Okay, so I've done a little bit of rendering here, and I hope you enjoyed watching that. I wanted to like jump back in here because now I can show you some other stuff. Number one, this whole time I've just been using that same brush, the the custom brush that I have, the pencil rough, but I've got all these other brushes that I haven't talked about or mentioned. And when you're doing rendering, I think it's actually nice to experiment with different brushes. So you're welcome again to have this brush set. And if you go online to the internet and do a search for um, Photoshop brushes, you'll find all kinds of stuff that you can use. So I'm going to zoom in on my painting here and just show you this brush that I've selected. So this is a brush I made a long time ago. It's I call it a rust texture. So the way brushes work in Photoshop is you can create them to have like special edges and do things like what this brush is doing. For instance, this brush rotates every time you click. So the edges change every single time. Now that's really cool because to me that's what a traditional brush would do. You know, the hairs, bristles of a brush, you know, no matter how you try to control them or if they fray over time, they develop this kind of character and they start to change. Now, the real trick with this is I think, you know, you have to be careful because this can also get a little bit absurd. There's some pretty goofy brushes out there. And just because you have a nice fancy set of brushes that you paid for or whatever, that's not going to make you a better artist. You have to understand what these brushes do. And I think there's fun to be had with that as well. So what I would recommend is you just kind of go by instinct. I hope on the next video, I'm going to have time to show you how to build a brush. It's a little bit complicated. I don't want to take away too much time from the rendering part of the character that we're doing, but I'll see what I can do. I mean, if you guys don't mind watching a longer video, I can just attach it on there. It's a little bit cumbersome, but I think it's good to know. It's definitely a more advanced topic for digital painting. The same could be said for Procreate because you can also build your own brushes in Procreate, which I'm still learning how to do. I'm not really as good at that app as I am this one. The point I'm trying to make is that when you're rendering like this, you're making these really refined marks that you're using to try to, you know, explain what it is that you're painting. So I think you can achieve similar results with just the same brush, like just the number one brush. And the reason I say that is because as a person that does a lot of pencil drawing, I can tell you that I can use the same pencil in different ways to get different marks. Like I can lay the lead on its side, I can carve the lead with a knife to make it really sharp, or I can blunt it on purpose to like make kind of a more softer kind of burnishing type drawing device. And, you know, so with the same tool, the same pencil, I can achieve all these different marks and kind of do the same thing. So just because you have a fancy brush doesn't really mean anything. But if you have a brush that you really like that produces a certain effect, I say go for it. And the only way you're going to find and figure that out is by just getting into the software and finding a couple of brush sets like the ones that I have, and you're welcome to have them. And I can, if you want, you can ask me questions about other brush sets that I have, and I can point you in the direction of those as well. And it's just like going to the art store, you know? You buy some brushes and you try them out. And you hear about brushes from other artists, right? If you go work in a studio with some other people, you'll see what they're doing and go, hey, you know, what brush is that? And they'll tell you, I have a Grumbacher, this or that, or Winsor Newton, such and such. And you'll be like, oh, okay, I want to go buy that and try it. It's kind of the same thing. You know, you're just going to go and try these brushes. And then eventually what I hope is that you learn to make your own. And I will say on that note that having traditional painting experience is extremely helpful with that, because really what you're doing is you're creating a footprint of a brush, like the mark that that brush would make on a traditional medium. You're trying to replicate that like as a footprint. And then, you know, you kind of take it from there. You're actually like expanding on that with, when you learn like how the brushes operate here, then you can mess around with designing brushes in that manner as well, not just how they're shaped, but how they perform. So I like this rust texture brush. I think it's adding a nice little layer of texture here to this image, which is really nice. Now I could probably replicate that with a regular brush, but it would take a little bit longer. So this is nice. I think you should kind of go back and forth. You know, don't use the same brush too much. I have some other ones here I really like. Like I have this blender brush, which is good for blending. And I didn't mention this before, and I'll try and kind of talk more about this on my last video tomorrow, is style. You know, I am definitely more of a painterly style type digital artist. Like I try to replicate my oil painting backgrounds, you know, and you know, I like pen and ink as well, so I do a lot of pen and ink work that's not really much different from the pen and ink I would do traditionally. So you know, if you have good experience with traditional art, try to apply that as much as you can. Like be as faithful to that as possible. I wouldn't switch to emulating a traditional media that you don't have experience with. And I'll just tell you a quick story about that. So for me, that was airbrushing. I stink at airbrushing. It's just not my thing. I tried it. I had the fancy airbrush. It's called a Palate AB. It's a double action airbrush. It costs hundreds of dollars. I had to get it for grad school. I practiced and practiced and practiced. And I just don't like it. Not only is it technically very difficult to use, I just don't like the style. It's usually a very soft edged kind of, you know, and you can do some incredibly detailed work. I had a colleague who could draw like he would with a pencil with that Palate airbrush, and it was just sickening. You know, you're just like, how can you possibly be that good at doing this? Anyway, my point is when I got thrown into Photoshop painting, I had to emulate that style, which is why in grad school they also had us doing traditional media. Now, I really struggled with that because, again, I was an oil painter, so I like kind of making marks. I like building up opaque marks with my brush. I don't like airbrushing. It's just not my thing. I make it sound horrible. I mean, it's a pretty awesome medium, but it's just not me. So whenever humanly possible, if you really like a certain style, find the traditional analog version of that and practice that first. You know, especially if you're in college or if you're in high school and you have a good, you know, art program, like really put pressure on your professors or, you know, your art teacher and say, hey, tell me, you know, maybe you want to know how to do airbrush. And then you need to say, what do I need to do? Like, point me in the right direction so I can learn airbrush, because I want to get better at it as a digital artist before I start, you know, painting in that style. Just trust me on this. You know, it's worth it, because personally, I think you should always have an analog alternative. Like this whole week, the power's been going out, I guess, because more people are at home now, and there's not, you know, the power company's trying to supply all these people at once. So I've had to, you know, switch over to my sketchbook because my computer was out of power and my iPad was out of power. So if I was going to draw, I was going to have to do it traditionally. And you should always have that. All right, so the other thing I wanted to show you, because I'm pushing, like, I'm definitely over an hour now, so I want to try to speed this up a little bit, is using texture brushes to do special effects. Or that's probably not the best word for it, but doing special lighting passages is what I'm going to call that. What do I mean by that? Well, like really intense highlights, and also something called refraction. So I'm going to pick a brush for this. It doesn't matter what brush you use, but I like to use something with a little bit more texture. So this is a brush I made. It's called the Oil Brush Toothy. It's number 7. So if you zoom up really high on this and then do a brush stroke, that's what it looks like. So it's like this really kind of almost looks like a snake skin or something. But if you zoom out on that, what you end up getting is kind of a very strokey, loaded brush. It's almost like you take an oil brush and you really load it up with paint with not too much medium. And what you're going to get is this kind of streaky, brushy thing. So what I like to do, I don't think I would normally do this at this point in the painting, but this is just for a demonstration, is if you look here in the image, especially on this really cool urn on the left, you see where the light is hitting the object? And it looks like it's glowing. Well, what's happening there is the light is hitting the surface of this vase, and it's also very, it looks like it's very dimpled. Like there's it's pretty banged up, So where the light is going over the edges of these dimples, where the light is most intense, the light is kind of refracting a little bit as it goes over the edge. And what that does is it almost creates like a color, a very intense color. In this case, to me, it looks like there's a little bit of red, hot red and pink, and a little bit of yellow in there. So there's a trick to this to achieve that effect. It's called soft light. So I'm going to pick this brush, and before I do anything else, I think I'm going to build up this light area a little bit more because it's looking a little weak. I kind of painted over it too much. So I'm going to add that in a little bit here like that. And now I'm going to switch to, let's see, I'm going to choose this kind of yellowish orange to try first. And then I'm going to change my brush mode here in the options window to soft light, not the layer, just the brush. And then I'm going to come back in here and paint very carefully around the edges, this kind of refracting effect. Now, if I add a little bit of red in here, that should take up the red part, but I think I chose too intense a red there. There we go. Now, I tend to wait to do this until like the very end of the painting. Like I don't like to do this early on. The other thing is if I really want to push that light source, I can do the same here. I can add this kind of, that's like a yellowish white. And that's where I can put in some of that intense lighting right there like that. So soft light's really cool. It can do all these really fantastic effects. This really is nice, like when you're painting a person too, by the way. I know I mentioned, I think in the other video that I contemplated doing a portrait. I thought about it. In fact, I actually worked on something today that was kind of a portrait, but I changed my mind because I thought, I just really wanted to do this still life instead. So I wish I had more time and could do more videos because I would love to do a whole portrait video or like a series of those. Maybe we'll do that next time or we'll see. Okay, so last but not least, I should mention this too. That same thing I just did with the, that little trick right there. You can do the same thing with shadows, by the way. You can set your brush to multiply or soft light and use a dark color, and you can create some really intense shadows. So what I like to do towards the end is like get a dark red violet and try to go into my shadow areas and kind of punch that in there. It practically makes things, black, but not quite. And of course, you can always use the color window to adjust, and get that the best value that you can get. And if you noticed in the speed up section, I was doing that other thing too, where I use the key command to switch from the brush to the eyedropper. That's how I mix colors on the canvas. I just want to be really clear, that's not something you do in traditional media. In traditional oil painting, for instance, I would never do that. Or let's just say I would do that very sparingly. You always use your palette to mix colors. You don't mix colors on the actual canvas, but we don't really have that in digital media. So I just use colors that I've already mixed on the actual image and paint with those. The only time that gets to be a problem is if you don't have a nice mix of colors to begin with, that can get very homogeneous and boring. So every once in a while, it's nice to just inject a different color. Like in this case, like this light green might be nice to throw in there, because I kind of see that over here anyway. Like that's like that other vial that's, or font that's kind of got that color reflecting. I'm about done here, but and another thing I wanted to say is please don't take this demo too literally. I would never ever go this far into rendering on just one part of a painting. Like that was just for a demonstration. I would have built up, you know, more general lights and shadows for everything on here before I moved into this level of detail. I think that's a not a great habit, because, well, you can get too fixated on one particular part of your image and then not finish the rest of it. Or unless that's intentional, you know, like if you're trying to intentionally, you know, like kill off another part of your painting or something by not rendering it too much or just making it less important, that's fine. But, you know, if you're going to give extra, you know, or the same level of attention to the entire still life here, I would not do what I did. You know, don't take what I'm doing too literally. Always kind of spread the love around so that you're rendering stuff equally. This is really bugging me because that pear is not that close to the vase. I don't know why I didn't catch this earlier, so I want to fix that. It's literally like just kissing it, like right there. So what I'm going to do is paint the background color like right into this, just to kind of edit that. I guess I could do that too with the silhouette, but you know, I don't really want to do that. So again, the whole point of what I was showing you today, and I really hope you use this in your own work, is we all like to render. You know, we all like to get to that really cool part of a painting where you're doing all this detail work and stuff. But you got to get to that point first with a good foundation. You know, the best way to do that is to block in shapes, block in your lighting, and block in your colors as fast as you can. Then you can go back and do all this fun stuff, like, you know, picking different colors, you know, to add to the image to make it more interesting, and then like doing different brushes and stuff, cool stuff like that. You know, that's fun and very, you know, artistic in terms of like the choices that you're making and what you're drawing. But you can't really get to that point until you do your basics. You know, always remember your shapes and your values and your lighting. Those are all very important things, and that's, I hope today I showed you a technique that you can use that can get that done fairly quickly so that you can get to the fun stuff as fast as you can. Well, I really appreciate y'all watching today. And again, if you have any questions at all, feel free to ask. I'll pull this up real quick. This is my email, although I think I messed up the layer, so I might have to fix that real quick. Yeah, I even drew on this layer. Okay, so this is my email at Kennesaw State. It's cbrasco@kennesaw.edu. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. If you want a copy of the Photoshop file that I'm painting today, you're welcome to have that. Just ask. And if you need files at all from any of the previous videos, you can ask for those too. And thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you for our final video tomorrow. Have a nice day.